Good morning, everybody. My name is Kirsten Dunlop. I am the Chief Executive of an organisation called Climate-KIC, which is a European-funded platform for financing, convening, catalysing systemic change through innovation. And it's my very great pleasure to moderate this panel this morning. I'm going to propose, in light of the IPCC report this week, that we might want to change the title from Driving Cost Efficiencies to Driving Human Survival in a context of ambitious decarbonisation and renewable strategies. And in fact, much of what we have been discussing and would like to bring to this conference is a number of examples, tangible examples of where progress is being made, of successes. Success breeds success, and we're going to need that in the face of some of the stark realities that we know we face. And the representatives of the organizations that are here on this panel are all organizations that know what was coming in that report and have known it for some time and know the scale of the challenge that faces us and have been working very deliberately and determinedly to do something about that in very different ways. What we have here actually is a rather representative sample of the patterning that we are seeing over the last 10, 20, 50 years with quite significant progress and breakthrough success in renewable energy, particularly high-tech, particularly applied to big infrastructure, and oddly missing and delayed and kind of less progress in many other aspects of greenhouse gas emissions and other applications. And we have here, in many ways, represented a lot of strong stories to tell about the progress in renewables, what it means to be ambitious, what it means to think in terms of supply chains, and at the same time, not nearly enough progress, and some reflections and insights on what more we need to do. And we also have represented the voice, similarly, I was also listening to Sarah before, listening in GCAS, to the minority voice about what about all the rest? Land use, agriculture, food, forestry, core materials, the hard-to-abate industries, the stuff that we absolutely have to get up to the same scale of ambition and the same scale of focus. So I'm going to start this panel by calling our attention to the fact that if you had time this week to read the IPCC report and you went beyond the executive summary and started to read the devil in the detail, you'll see that there's one scenario in there that actually keeps us safe at safe is a relative term, 1.5 degrees with a 66% of reliability. And that scenario would require us to be net zero emissions globally by 2035. So I want you to just keep that in mind as you listen and as you engage and you think about the questions for these respondents, because here we are talking about intervening systemically along the pathways of supply chains and across the boundaries that were called for in the previous session. And we're talking about organizations that are pitting themselves in front of those questions. We have 4 speakers and we're going to run it in this order. So first we'll hear from Giovanni Tula from Enel, Green Power. Then we'll pass to Morten Blomqvist, who will speak to us about the work that Ørsted are doing. Raffaele Do, who is working in the World Wildlife Fund Landscape Finance Lab, and Sam Kimmins, running the RE100 initiative referred to earlier with the Climate Group. And what I'll do is throw each of them a question and ask them to speak specifically to some of the things that they are working on. I might throw in a few questions later. We'll make sure that there should be about 20 minutes or so for your questions and for a lively debate amongst us, given what we're challenging ourselves to address. So Giovanni, if I can, the Head of Innovation and Sustainability for Enel Green Power, with a long background in business, understanding the complexity of driving this kind of change in business. Enel is a major utility, high profile, risk exposed, which has really changed its strategy to become an organization investing exclusively in renewables. And of course, that isn't an overnight process. I know that one of your challenges is how to take Enel to the point where you are sustainable in everything you do. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure, Kirsten, thanks a lot. Enel Green Power belongs to the Enel Group and is actually the the growth engine of the group, because Enel is investing through Enel Green Power only in renewables. When we talk about new generation of electricity, we invest more or less 3 or 4 billions of euros every year in additional capacity. And we are also the driver for the access to electricity. The way we are investing so much in renewables is because we are in the middle of an energy transition. The energy transition has already started. And some analysis says that basically from now to 2050, more than 80% of the new capacity in electricity generation will be renewables. And this is mainly due to the fact that renewable are driven by 4 forces. As it was said before, in the panel before, one is the target. The energy sector received or got target years ago about decarbonization. This was one of the forces that are driving this change, this transition. But the second one is the competitiveness. Renewables are competitive. It sounds strange for some people. They do no longer need any tariff, any incentives, because they are more competitive than the fossil fuel generation in most of the market right now, and will be more and more in the future. This is mainly due to the fact that, for instance, the cost of PV panel decreased by 80% in the last 7, 8 years, and the same a little bit less for wind turbines. I mean, it's an amazing improvement in terms of cost reduction. And then also, I mean, the regulatory framework helped a lot because the feed-in tariff disappeared and appeared some auction system, some competitive mechanisms that help the system to be competitive. So what's happening basically? That the renewables are the answer to many problems that are around the energy. You know that more than 1 billion people are still living without access to electricity, half of which are in the sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at how renewable can reply to this, you can imagine that from the utility scale plants, I mean the big plants, to the small solution like mini-grid or off-grid system, to the home systems, all of them with renewables can provide an answer to one of these problems. As an Enel Group, we know that, and we are, I mean, very proud to work on this business, but we see that it's not enough. Because renewables are inherently green, but the way we do business, the way we build the new plant, the way we operate can make the difference. And that's why we decided to be sustainable in any single step of our process. And starting from the construction, for example, where we have established the so-called sustainable construction site. We call it a system where we measure our impacts and we identify solutions to mitigate the impacts and offsetting what we cannot mitigate. Especially for CO2 reduction is important, because also during the construction phase, we generate emissions directly or indirectly. So we are trying to measure, of course, not only ourselves, but also along the supply chain, our suppliers, and we push our suppliers to do the same. I mean, we are pushing them to do the same, and we identify solutions in order to mitigate the impact. Just a couple of examples. We recently built a new PV plant in Australia, in the middle of a desert area, very far away from everywhere, as it happens always in Australia. Kirsten knows it. And we decided, in order to mitigate the impact of the transportation, the logistics of the materials, to reactivate a former railways that was abandoned. And that's create a lot of problem for logistics, but on the other end, it gave us a great benefits, both in terms of CO2 emissions and also in terms of business. That's an example. Or other examples that we have are for instance, in South America, when we built a new plant, we need to start from scratch. Sometimes there is no energy on site, and we used to rely in the past mainly on diesel generators. Now it's changing, because we start first to start with the facility to produce energy, maybe some small power plants, some old solar plant with batteries, and then with those energy, we power all our activities for the construction. And there are other examples that I can bring you today, but I mean, considering the limited time that we have today, I'll stop here. Just another comment. Okay, it's our responsibility on how we do business. as a utility, it can make the difference. We push our contractors to be more sustainable, to measure their emissions and to try and to identify solutions to mitigate them. But also we have in mind also to help our customers. Because the basic for a utility is to generate energy and to put into the grid. That's it. But here, in order to help the C&I customers, maybe to go green and to take the advantage of this competitiveness of renewables, we are also preparing, how can I say, some customized solution for them, some long-term agreement for off-take agreement for energy, like PPA, power purchase agreement, and that can make the difference for a customer, a large company, to have the access to green energy, because basically we take the risk. They do not have to invest any capital on that, and they have also the predictability of the price. So this type of solution along the supply chain, of course, can help to push it to make this next step for reduction of the emission of CO2.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to keep passing forward. As you have questions, please log them in Slido so that we have them. Morten, so your interesting, fascinating shift in your life and in the life of this organization, another organization that has chosen to focus on being future fit and understands future fit as being about sustainability and decarbonization. In this case, we're talking about offshore wind, major infrastructure investments in offshore wind. And I know that you are now really investing resources in looking at how to address the carbon footprint way upstream and holistically around the entire supply chain of your business. Can you give us a sense of that?
Yes, maybe just to focus, approximately a year ago, we rebranded from Dong Energy to Ørsted, which was an important step for us because it demonstrated that we were selling off our oil and gas division, and we were phasing out coal within the next 5 years, and entirely focusing on renewable energy. So our main focus is offshore wind farms, massive investments that is now moving beyond just northern European countries and also at a global scale. So there's a lot of interesting investment opportunities as a business, and therefore we moved away from the black energy to the green. So I think that's a first step, that we focused on changing our own operations. So from before looking at, I think approximately 80% of our carbon emission came from our own operation. Now in the future, about 75% will be in our supply chain. So that's why it's increasingly important to look into our supply chain as a business. I think therefore, the future fit supply chain is the hot topic and a well-chosen topic for this conference here, and something that we are starting to look into. I have to admit, we're also beginning the journey now. Our focus has been on our own operation, changing our business model, and now we're starting to look into our supply chain, how we can engage our strategic suppliers, how we can engage in broader partnerships. And when I talk about broader partnerships, then it's a matter of really engaging across industries. So we have to go and look into how we can collaborate with the mining industry, with the steel production companies, and all our other suppliers further down the supply chain. And that will be an interesting journey. And I can see already a lot of these business associations are saying we are part of the green transition, and looking into how they can actually improve their carbon footprint as well will be an important step to make not only green energy, but making the green energy even greener. So that's what we're looking at. So a few concrete examples of what we're doing at the moment. So for instance, installing offshore wind parks like the one we just opened last month here in the UK, producing energy for almost 600,000 households in the UK. Of course, it takes time. You use a lot of energy. What we're trying to do is reducing our use of fossil fuel for our vessels, or our suppliers' vessels, by looking into innovative approaches like using hybrid engines, looking into how you can use waste energy on board to actually using that energy on board on the vessels, how to have people living longer time nearby the wind turbines. The wind turbines can be located up to 100 kilometers offshore. So by not transporting people forth and back every day, you can actually save a lot of energy there as well. And then, I mean, the next steps in the future is really looking into, can we start plugging these vessels into our wind turbines so they get the energy directly from a wind turbine. So we're producing wind energy out there. So that's the next step. But that's where we need to go in and talk innovation and sustainable sourcing together. We have to link the two together, and that's what I find interesting in the future as well. I mean, we have to look into how we can consider how can we actually make the decommissioning of these wind parks in 20, 30 years' time, and how is that linked to the sourcing strategies and the designs of the wind turbines that we have today. I know at the moment across the wind industry as such, I mean, they're looking into the blades of the wind turbines, for instance. I mean, their glass fibers, it's one of the most difficult parts that we can not recycle that easily at the moment. So how can we do that better in the future? What kind of material can we use in the future, and so forth? Otherwise, we can have a problem within the next 20 or 30 years' time if we don't start thinking about this now. So I would say in our case, we have the opportunity to do things differently, and we also have a lot of work in front of us to actually do that. And I think that's the interesting topic, and I think a lot of it also goes for the agricultural session before here. I mean, focus on that supply chain. I mean, we have a lot of opportunities to start doing things differently, and having a future-fit supply chain in that sense is the interesting part.
Thank you, Martin. And that's actually a wonderful segue then into a completely different focus on decarbonization of supply chains through land use practices, and particularly land use practices in developing regions and areas of the world. Raffaele Do is the market lead for the World Wildlife Fund Landscape Finance Lab, something that Climate-KIC is very proud to support and partner with. And I know that the focus there has been really to think about enabling environments for change and taking a much more holistic perspective here in a very different level of scale. And we're talking here about shuttling between huge scale industry, infrastructure, supply, through to single scale production subsistence and the transformations that need to happen at all levels of scale. Raffaele, I would love to invite you to talk about the enabling environment as a principle, and about what you call appropriate solutions for a very different, specific local environments where the same implications, the same concerns, the same change is necessary. Can you give an example of what you are working on?
Thanks, Kirsten. Can you hear me? Shall I speak louder? So as you said, I work in a different environment as my two colleagues. And I guess when I think renewable energy or energy simply, I think about forests, wood fuel, biomass, charcoal. In the areas where WWF is active, around the tropical belt countries, in rural areas mainly, and around forests, we have to realize that wood fuel and charcoal are still the main source of energy for a lot of households. Up to 80% of households in a country like Cambodia, for instance, are still using charcoal and wood fuel just to cook rice or boil water. But also industries such as garment factories using this type of materials for thermal energy production, even ice production or brick production, just construction brick production, or burning forest out simply for cheap housing in Cambodia. This is quite appalling, and I'd like to make a parallel with the IPCC report that was just released 2 days ago, since you mentioned it. I think, historically there's been an general overlook on the forests, the land use change, as both a source of emission reduction potential. Potentially, by 2030, we could reach 30% of the emission reduction targets if we restore and conserve forest. And in parallel, the fact that energy in a lot of places, as I said, comes from forests. So, it's a huge gap of understanding, I think, and a missed opportunities as well in terms of investment, both on energy production, appropriate solutions, adapted solutions, less high-tech than what the examples we just heard. And so I'll give you just one example. We are being active with H&M, the apparel brand you're most familiar with, through the WWF H&M long-term partnership. So we're discussing, trust and bond creation in the earlier panel. I think that long relationship between the two organizations certainly is a success factor in that multi-stakeholder approach. And so what we're doing in Cambodia is really of twofolds, looking first at an alternative supply chain to produce sustainable energy from biomass. So instead of using wood fuel from primary forest or degraded forests, we're looking at char briquettes from cassava waste, rice husk, bamboo waste. These are rather, low cost and low tech solutions, but just regenerating the value of the existing biomass. So it's not expanding the biomass production, but rather using biomass more within the existing volumes. And the second thing, and so we're doing this with a couple of local experts. Obviously, you might know or might have heard of Jerez. We're doing this with the UNDP. There's a whole ecosystem around wood fuel in Cambodia, and this is particularly been built because electricity costs in a country like Cambodia are highly unaffordable. So wood fuel is basically cheaper than hydro or the grid electricity. And so the second thing we're doing is that we bring a carbon monitoring framework or umbrella framework to this energy new supply chain that would help garment factories, textile brands, and all that new supply chain we're creating to report against their targets, and that would be embedded in the national determined contribution. So we call this a jurisdictional approach using a RED+ mechanism. Some of you might be familiar with it. But I think what's interesting here is that we're looking at integrating those two components of the same project. On one hand, building a business case for a sustainable value chain on more sustainable renewable energy, and on the other hand, connecting a supply chain with conservation and forest restoration through a carbon monitoring system. Altogether, that creates a huge investment opportunity for climate funds, and I think we all know in this room that money is not so much the issue. It's rather, the scalability, the strength of the partnerships, and the level of ambition. So here we're building, that coalition of different actors from the garment industry, textile brands, the NGOs, because we're also doing this in partnership with WCS, also active in the same region. The UN agencies, de-risking, helping us to de-risk the investment framework, so that ultimately there is an investment opportunity for major climate funds looking at private investments, not grants. I guess that's probably the main example I'd like to share here. Maybe two last comments. We're doing this in many other countries. I mean, I think Sarah was mentioning cocoa. We're acting in the cocoa supply chain in Cameroon in particular. Also rubber and palm oil. These are commodities that I'm sure will be discussed these 2 days, but I wanted to bring this example on energy because that's quite specific to the panel focus. And the last comment I'd like to bring to your consideration is really, what's in it for H&M. H&M is being used as a leader, as a champion, with the idea that other textile brands will come along. So there's pre-competitive collaboration happening here. But for them, it's not so much a cost efficiency issue. I mean, obviously they've got renewable energy targets and efficiency targets, but it's more a climate resilience and security of supply within the supply chain. So when investing in such a country, high-profile risk country such as Cambodia, you really need to invest in your supply chain in a different way. And I think climate resilience is really the smartest move H&M has done until now. But it's not that easy to connect your supply chain to conservation and forest restoration targets. I'll probably pause here and happy to dig further later on.
Thank you very much. So now let's bring this up to a level of multi-layered, multi-dimensional interventions across a number of industries in the form of the RE100 initiative. Sam Kimmins heads the initiative for the Climate Group, and this represents for the kind of determined systems change initiative that we're going to need a lot more of. with a clear focus on driving 100% of renewable energy in corporations across the world and making that the norm. There are many questions that emerged for me in talking with Sam. Some of them around why 100%? For me it seems obvious, but I think there's a really interesting question there around how does setting targets in that way really unlock ambition and potential, and why are supply chains important in what you're doing, Sam?
Great, thank you very much, Kirsten. Is my microphone working? Yes. Excellent. Hello, everyone. So I'm Sam Kimmins, the head of RE100 with the Climate Group. The RE100 is an initiative led by the Climate Group in partnership with CDP. We started in 2014 with founder members Ikea and Swiss Re. To date, 152 companies have committed to RE100, which is committing to use 100% renewable electricity across their global operations by, at the latest, 2050. Many of our members have set targets significantly before that. At 2020, some have already achieved their 100% goal. So we're really racing forward. And this is not small companies. This is, we were recently joined by Sony. As I say, our founder member was Ikea, who currently own more wind turbines than they do stores. Facebook are rapidly approaching 100%. General Motors, Dalmia Cement, Walmart, Bank of America, Citigroup, HSBC, Unilever, Nestle, AkzoNobel, Grupo Bimbo, companies from across the world with terawatt scale demand for electricity are committing to RE100. And they're putting their money where their mouths are. As I mentioned, IKEA own more wind turbines than they do stores. A number of our members are actively buying on-site renewables and engaging in power purchase agreements with organizations such as Enel, Ørsted, and many small independent renewable electricity providers. We're about to get our statistics through for this year. We collect data from our members each year, and we're thinking we're going to be on, well, we were on 33% renewable across the membership last year. We think we're going to be improving on that, despite the fact there are a number of new members. Why are companies doing this? And when we started RE100 in 2014, a lot of people thought we were a little bit crazy. Nobody is ever going to do this. Well, as Giovanni pointed out earlier, the cost of solar has reduced by 80%, 80%, over the past 7 or so years. And the cost of renewables, on average, globally, are falling by about 10% per year. We talk the business case. Investors want it, the companies want it because it saves them money. We're hearing 30% savings in Australia at the moment. And the tier one in the supply chain also want it, which I shall come on to later. We seldom talk about climate change. I seldom mention 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, Paris Agreement, etc., partly because I'm a little bit tired of it. I hear it all the time. I work in a climate charity. But also it turns off some of our major constituents. If I go to the Australian government and talk about 2 degrees, they're not listening. If I go to Texas and talk about 2 degrees, they're not listening. But if we talk about dollars, they are listening. Altogether, our members represent around, well, last year they represented 94 billion in investment opportunity in renewable electricity. And this is really opening doors both with suppliers and also with governments, because the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So in some countries it's very easy to get renewables at a very low price, significantly lower than coal. In others, such as Japan, South Korea, and others, it is rather difficult to get hold of renewables because the markets are not set up for that, which is where RE100 comes in. We open those doors at government level and we have the conversations about, hey, if you don't invest in this, you're going to be left behind. You're going to miss out on this. Well, last year, 94 billion. This year, probably 140 billion, and rising significantly each year. Pot of money that companies want to invest in renewable energy systems. So, first, I'll address why 100%. Well, as Steve Howard, formerly with Ikea, put it, 100% leaves no room for doubt. If you've committed to 100%, nobody in your organization is going, oh, phew, that's not me. You can't say, well, we won't bother with this in South Korea because it's a little bit difficult. We'll just do it in the States. And one large company recently did that and couldn't join RE100 as a result. Our companies really are putting their money where their mouths are. A great example of this is the 13 Japanese companies who recently joined us. Sony, Fujitsu, Ricoh, Aeon, who are Japan's largest retailer, joined RE100 in Japan precisely because it is difficult to get hold of renewable electricity in demand. It's hard to get hold of renewable electricity in Japan, and they wanted to send a very strong signal to the government, which has opened up conversations with 3 ministries. Apple are currently in Japan, speaking with a number of government officials and NGOs. I'll be there in a couple of weeks. It's really caused a stir. So 100% is important, both organizationally and in terms of impact. Second thing, why supply chains? Well, the RE100 commitment is just for the company's own operations, but our members are noticing, well, hang on, up to 80% of our impact is in our supply chain. So let's look into our supply chains. To date, 23 Apple suppliers have committed to 100% renewable for Apple products. BT, Walmart, Unilever, Ikea, Apple, and numerous others are also asking their suppliers to use renewable electricity. Partly reputation, partly carbon emissions, but also because it makes business sense. And this, again, is having an impact on supply chains. Askell, one of our recent Japanese joiners, described RE100 as their passport to international trade. They're finding that so many of the people they supply to are asking for renewable electricity. They went, hey, let's just go for it. Let's go for 100%. The other advantage of reaching into your supply chain is if you're H&M, another of our members, if you're Nike, another member, or if Decathlon, another member, and you have a very large supply chain in Vietnam or in Indonesia, if you have numerous shoe manufacturers on the Isle of Busan, and they're shared between all these different organizations, and you have a very small office in those countries, you can't afford to do one of these big power purchase agreement deals. But if you've got a huge number of wriggly tin sheds full of people making shoes using a lot of energy, they've got a lot of roof area, they've got a lot of buying power. And so increasingly our members are teaming up with their supply chains to go, okay, we can work together and get renewable electricity at low price in the regions where it's difficult, and together we have a voice that is loud enough to create change at government level and at supplier level. So this is very much an area we're focusing on. We're working with the Rocky Mountain Institute and CDP to bring together our joint efforts to bring renewable electricity into the supply chain and really create a movement to create not just incremental change, but exponential change. And I'll be in California next week running a workshop on that with 20 global corporations, learning how they can push renewables through their supply chain. Final point, does this really make business sense? Well, we're getting a lot of data in about the cost savings of renewables, so we're starting to build a very real picture. But we've always said that our members are better run companies, and we've kind of, we think our members are better run companies. Last month, Capgemini helped us to prove that. They ran an analysis of the business performance of RE100 members to compare to their sector peers, and all outperformed their sector. So each sector within RE100 outperformed their sector more generally, which while there's not a direct causal relationship, what it shows is that companies who are investing in renewable electricity are smart companies who make smart investment decisions. And that goes for your suppliers if they're also investing in renewable electricity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we will have about 20 minutes for questions, well, about 15 actually. There are a couple of questions. I know if there's a lot of questions up on Slido, there's a couple that I want to just pull out as threads of conversation to address. There's questions about carbon price and how that might effectively support a lot of what's happening and what would really be necessary in terms of pricing in externalities properly. There's questions about engaging large organisations, to what extent, even in initiatives like RE100, are people buying certificates to move the problem slightly sideways, as opposed to address the full 100% no space for manoeuvre. What's the space for carbon offset programs after reduction in sustainability? And I think there's a couple of patterns that I'd also like to draw into what we've heard. One is around the blurring of suppliers and producers, and a world in which increasingly the integration of initiatives. I was thinking about some of the work that's come out recently around the relationship between setting up wind farms and solar farms, and the change to the surface condition of the soil that occurs as a result because of the microclimates created by them, and therefore a set of opportunities around agriculture and food and land use that open up a whole different set of bringing in multiple cash flows, multidimensional solutions. And thinking also, again, recently at GCAS, listening to Cristiana Figueras in the Under 2 Degrees Coalition, talking about the latest report from the Commission on Climate and Economy, which suggests that there's a $26 trillion opportunity in decarbonisation and 65 million new jobs. So it's not small business, it's big business. So I think let's start with some questions here about what are some of, let's start with how are suppliers better supported to work towards this kind of transition, or do each of you believe that this is about accelerating as fast as we can, and starting with, the question here is, are we trying to eat dessert before we finish our veg? Can we afford to think like that? Anyone wishing to take that?
Maybe I can
Do we need pathways and transition, or do we need to go for a hard line 100% and just shift the whole lot to renewables?
Okay. If you want.
I mean, it's a difficult question. I think, I mean, it's a matter of moving ahead. I mean, looking at the upcoming investments. I mean, I used the case before with our vessels, for instance. I mean, all our new vessels that we are leasing at the moment will be at a different technology level, which is in much lower carbon emissions and so forth. So I think it's more looking ahead on rather than looking backwards on our suppliers, but working with our suppliers, saying this will be an increasing demand in our tenders, and if you want to work with us, this is the way we're working forward, basically. Because suppliers, for a lot of different businesses, I mean, you have long-time commitments with your suppliers. It takes time to build up the relationship. It's not something you can change. Just in some tenders you can, but in most of it, it's long-term strategic partners, and you work together with them. I think that's the way forward. Coming up with a very clear message that this is the way we're going forward, and having initiative with your, I mean, the Apple example you're coming up with, how many tier 1 suppliers actually committed to your supply chain that way. I think that's a good KPI actually.
And so let's take that question to you, Sam, on how many of the organisations within RE100 are taking this challenge in full, or are buying certificates to accelerate their credentialing?
So I'd reframe that question. So we released a leadership report back in July this year, looking at what does leadership mean in renewable electricity sourcing? How can you have an impactful sourcing strategy? And it's a complex environment. It is difficult in some countries to buy renewable electricity. It's incredibly easy in others. It's also difficult if you're a small office on the, HSBC They may run one floor of a 20-story building, and their landlord supplies their electricity. You can't get a wind farm built off the coast of Ireland to power that one floor. So there is a range of options are needed. Certificates do play an important role. I view certificates as your receipt for buying renewable electricity. There's a bit of a myth that certificates are some kind of silver bullet that, yeah, you just buy them and you're sorted. Certificates are the basis of a renewable electricity market. You need certificates to prove that you've bought your renewable electricity from this wind farm, from this hydro plant, or from that solar farm. And so they are a very important part. And I think I wouldn't say any of our members are not doing their bit. 152 companies committed to 100% renewable electricity and demonstrating they're making progress year on year. In Japan, it's impossible to buy renewable electricity at scale. Ricoh, Fujitsu, and 11 other Japanese companies are actively engaging with Minister Kono, Minister Nakagawa, and METI. They're actively engaging at senior level with their CEOs, saying, we want to buy renewable electricity. Now, is that more leading? Is that more advanced? Is that more commitment than a company in the US who's saying, great, well, I can engage with a PPA in Texas where I can get my electricity 10% cheaper, job done. You know, both are impactful.
Thank you. I want to leapfrog actually from that to the question then of getting competitors to work together in a scenario where perhaps there's very aligned interest, but there are other scenarios where there's not always an aligned interest, or they're dealing with very diverse customer bases, which is at the core of one of the questions here. Raffaele, I know you have experience in getting competitors to work together in projects that wouldn't normally bring them together. Is there something you could say about that as a design principle for what we're doing?
Sure. I guess in the textile industry, just to come back to the example I was sharing earlier, when you look into your supply chain, very often the case is that you would share garment factories, so you would share your supply chain with other brands. And so when you look at it, the energy cost or the energy needs of the offices of H&M, Adidas, Puma, CNA, Marks and Spencer in those sourcing countries are very, very small. The majority of the footprint is within, tier 2, tier 3. So tier 3 would be different because that's raw materials for cotton. That's a different story. Carbon soil is different world even. But when you're looking at energy, as I mentioned earlier, there is a common interest and shared vision. I think that was Sarah Scheffer who was mentioning that shared vision that is very strong and shared. So actually we'll have a workshop coming up in January where we'll share all the feasibility studies on how that business and investment framework could work in the country, in the case of Cambodia. And so we'll invite obviously all the competitors, all the garment factories, the ones that are already moving on to solar roofs or other types of renewables, and just to test our assumptions. So it's really a crafting a business model that would be relevant for the entire industry. So to answer one of the questions, yes, of course, we work with H&M competitors, and this is very much a pre-competitive collaboration, just again to secure the supply before it's too late and before the forests are already gone. Just one last point. I mean, there's an urgency, I think, particularly on this type of energy needs, because deforestation is accelerating at a really, really fast rate. In Cambodia, 2016, that was the highest rate of deforestation. So there is an urgency. And maybe one last point, sorry, adding last points all the time, but from a WWF perspective, with local offices in those countries, having private partners in a coalition, not only one, but several, is a tremendous leverage for advocacy. It's one thing to come as an NGO group and say, well, we would recommend you to incentivize here and there, but it's a different story when you come with the support of an entire industry who represent 30% of the GDP of the country, saying, we need this, we know this, we need those incentives for our investment to make sense in the future and for our sustainability plans.
Giovanni, how do you feel about that from a large listed organization operating under market pressure? I think not only the element of competitors, but also the element of government engagement. We have a question also about would it make sense for governments to be involved in RE100, for example? So let's hear from you on this blending of actors.
The government involvement is very important because they basically they are those that release the regulation that may help the customers to have access to renewable energy. For instance, so one of the barriers for the for large customers to buy energy was explained before by Sam is the regulation. So government have to be involved and have to also understand that, and I come back to one of the questions about carbon, that carbon price is no longer interesting. I mean, it's no longer in the focus of companies or anyone else, because looking at the future, we know that carbon won't be competitive. You know, and that's why governments have to change their mindset, because sometimes there are still some, funds that are given to the carbon industry, and this is, not really, this is changing a little bit the perception of the competitiveness of each source of energy. So government have this very important role of the regulate and to make all technologies neutral. I mean, in order to give all the same opportunities. I know that in the past, renewables took the advantage of the feed-in tariffs, but it was the only way, I mean, to make the system starting. But now we think that government have a very important role, especially in the emerging markets, in emerging countries, where in many cases it's so difficult for a private operator to enter in the market and to make their business proposition to the country. And when we go, for instance, in country like, an example in Ethiopia, where we are building a new PV plant, it's we understand how important it is for them to this type of plant, because, for instance, 100 megawatt plant, PV plant, give access to clean energy to 40,000 people. It is just a plant. It is big, but not so big, I mean. And the regulation on this is very important in order to allow also to private people, to private sector, to private customers to have access to this electricity and to provide them with contracts.
Can I ask I'm going to come back to this question of let's pull governments into RE100 and how could we make that work? But a question around demand, because I think one of the elements that's up here also is around the extent to which, as organizations or as NGOs, we are actually working to change the structures of what we live with by starting with changing demand, or we're still focused on substitution of the means of production or substitution of the means of energy, but we're not fundamentally changing the core demand, whether it's for food, the reference to the EAT Foundation and changing some of our core understanding about consumption of food or energy itself, or indeed the impact on wood. Anything that any one of you would have to say about intervening to change and reframe demand itself?
Yeah. If you can just talk about the energy, of course. One of the things that are very innovative things that are moving on now are the demand and response services. I mean, not only to provide clean energy, but also to help the customer to change their demand profile of energy in order to optimize their consumptions and to make energy efficiency. That's part of the change. It implies for them to change their process, their production process, they are a factory or whatever, you know. So that's something that is changing in our sector.
Okay. Martin?
And maybe also on the IPCC report, I mean, energy demand with climate change in the future, it's likely to rise. First of all, hopefully, because the 1 billion people without modern electricity today will have access to it. So that's one way. But also, I mean, higher temperatures requires more energy to cool down houses and so forth in the future. So energy demand is likely to increase. So looking at how we can actually reduce the consumption is really important. I mean, in Denmark, at least, I mean, on all new housing, you have very clear certification schemes and regulation how well these new buildings should be built to actually meet new energy consumption needs. And then secondly, then, I mean, in our case, we're also installing at the moment 1 million smart meters in houses. So people actually get cheaper tariffs during nighttime, for instance, where there's low demand. Because at the moment with renewable energy, I mean, The bottleneck at the moment is storage. So, I mean, the wind is also blowing at night in our case, but the consumption is low, so sometimes we have wasted energy. So if we can have people starting to use more energy at nighttime, I mean, doing the laundry at night or charging your car at night, then, I mean, it's one way of doing it as well.
And Raphael, if I pass that to you with a question here, fast fashion is a large polluter due to its huge production volumes. How is, for example, the project with WWF and H&M addressing that, the kind of underlying pull from the market?
Sorry, which one is that?
It's a question around fast fashion.
Oh, fast fashion.
The top one, yeah, there you go. And it's a similar sort of problem, the demand for a change of clothes every season, every 6 months, every year.
I'm not sure I'm the best place to answer that question. I wish there would be an H&M representative. We tried to bring them, but they were busy. So, yeah, I guess, you know, it's all about, you know, consumer engagement. And I do believe, I mean, another example is Ikea. I do believe that those fast, you know, it's not really fast consumer good products, but it's fast fashion or fast, you know, furniture type of shops. They are rethinking their business model. They are welcoming different practices in their consumer habits. They are checking and monitoring the change of behaviors, and they are offering different solutions. I don't know if you've been aware of the Ikea, I forgot how it's called, but they released just a month ago a climate awareness report. So they tested over a year or two the understanding of their own consumers. And so that will just fit into their new strategy. So, sorry not to use the H&M example, but they're getting there slowly, probably slower than other industries. But there is, in the textile industry, a whole awareness on how to rethink the business, how to recycle from old clothes, you know, using the same brands, just all products into their line of manufacturing. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't really bring much more insight at this stage, particularly on H&M.
Sam, did you want to pick up on a couple of the comments that were raised before?
Yeah, just I think on the, you know, should we be focusing on one thing or another? We should be focusing on all of the things. It's a big fight, and there's different parts to play. There's a huge ecosystem of NGOs and campaigns, businesses, business activities, all focusing on you know, renewable electricity, energy productivity. We have an energy productivity campaign, EP100, that's the sister campaign of RE100, and the commitment is to double your energy productivity. We also have an electric vehicles campaign. There's a number of different strands to be had. I think one of the challenges the environmental movement has is we can be a little bit pious, and I think in the past we have equated success with people suffering and using less, and I don't think we're going to win with that. So I think we have some very positive stories to tell on substitution, and we're generating some very positive stories on efficiency, using less, etc., through the work of people such as Ikea. So I look forward to seeing those develop, but in the meantime we have some real winners, and we shouldn't slow progress on those because we're not making so much progress on other elements.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Now we are at the close. I'm just going to make a couple of summarizing reflections. We've heard about innovation and sustainability traveling together, and the opportunity to use that combination to look for cross-boundary, multi-dimensional solutions that are blurring boundaries, like supply, demand, supply, production, consumers, and makers. We've heard about bringing competitors to work together with government, with policy, in local contexts and in large global contexts. We had some conversation earlier about who to learn from, and a question to kind of throw out for all of us. If we took seriously net zero globally by 2030, how the hell can we learn as fast as possible how to do that, and how that question lands with each of us? And I think the last thing I would land on is in terms of economic design. One of the most interesting things that I hear that emerges across these conversations and examples is the design of cost levers, value, risk levers, whether it's flattening volatility, creating greater stability, security of supply chain, the opportunity to design in multiple cash flows because of, for example, freeing up working capital that is otherwise managing the risk of volatility. And those volatility risks will increase as we hit more and more unstable temperature change effects. So I would like to ask you to welcome me to join me in thanking the panel members and to thank you very much for your questions. I believe at this point, if I'm not wrong, we have